You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. We've had you for probably, not sure how many straight. I think you made me do one solo, and then I did the interviews with Heather and then Dr. Fox and Dr. Diane, but pretty much you've been consistent this year.
Very, very. I'm looking forward to the days when we have both video and audio podcasts, and we have a setup like Junior Dale Earnhardt Junior's. You know, we'll be on camera, sitting opposite each other. I'll convince you. Don't worry.
Anyhow, for our listeners, we have a episode today that we're going to talk about something we talk about quite often, and it is testing necessary if you see visible mold? And, you know, for our listeners, even if you listened maybe 6 months ago, a year, 2 years ago, I mean, we've been doing this since, 2019, I think? But anyhow, I've evolved a little bit. In the past, I was very, very adamant about you don't need to do any testing if you see visible mold. The next step's remediation. Why waste your money? But I have evolved with that.
Absolutely.
And a lot of it's, you know, from scenarios I've dealt with recently, and you keep telling me you love data, but you keep telling me, nope, you got to have this, this, and this.
Absolutely. Having a baseline of just about everything gives you some place to assess later the progress that's been made or not made.
Yeah. Well, my whole point is, you know, it's easy for me to say, well, you don't really need testing if remediation's the next step. That's a very generic stance, and every situation is different.
Absolutely.
Like, you know, we could have a client that maybe has known for years that, you know, they have Lyme's, they're mold sensitive, they have CIRS, which is CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, chronic fatigue, Hashimoto's. They could have certain conditions that maybe would change our overall take on the remediation. But on the other hand, the reason that in the past I had the stance you don't need any testing, and I never said you'd never need any, but the reason I didn't believe you really needed it was because we treat every mold remediation project like there are mycotoxins spread throughout the home.
Absolutely. I mean, you take it very, very seriously. And
Right.
And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. I also think, though, for a lot of us who are not experts in a particular industry, when it comes to our health, it's so easy to get freaked out about what you're visibly seeing. But when you can actually match up the numbers to what you're seeing, it helps people feel like they understand what's going on. So there's less of a freak out about it if you can actually say, okay, this is what's here. You know, and sometimes too, like there have been many times when I've said to you, look look at that black looking thing. Is that mold? And you're like, no, that's a water stain. Well, I am not an expert. I can't tell the difference between a water stain and Stachybotrys. So I also think that having baseline testing is good because sometimes what we think we're visibly seeing as mold actually isn't.
Right. Once again, there are circumstances where, we have to do testing so that the insurance will cover it, the homeowner's insurance. But to look at it from the other perspective, a lot of times what we're visually seeing at the time, and just to kind of backtrack a little bit, our listeners probably understand this, but for CNC Contractor Services, we will not do mold remediation without an inspection. And the reason behind that, and for those, we've talked about this a few weeks ago, think it's a conflict of interest, we do an inspection so that we can visibly see what we're being told. On top of that, we can do the testing we believe is necessary, even if we're doing remediation. But on the other hand, a scenario I want to throw out to our listeners, it's not uncommon for me to go in there. My client calls and says, Steve, we need remediation. We don't want to waste our money on an inspection. I say, hey, sorry, this is just how we operate. As far as costs, we'll figure that out. But when we go and look at it, what we're seeing visibly is not the whole picture. So what we're seeing on this side of the wall in a bathroom, and we test it with a tape lift, we could open up the wall cavity, and let's say that tape lift, there's no Stachybotrys, there's no Chaetomium, no Fusarium. Those are kind of the three triggers that we have concerns. If we don't see those mold types, that doesn't mean those mold types are not there. A lot of times we start with our flood cut, and then we pull that sheetrock back, and there could be all sorts of different molds. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And I guess my whole point is if you're testing to determine the type of remediation you're going to do, that is not a good idea. And I want our listeners to understand that.
Yeah.
Because once again, your remediation contractor, restoration company, whoever's doing it, they should treat every mold infestation as if there were toxigenic mold types there.
Oh, absolutely. Because they actually, when they day one of mold remediation, they don't actually know yet what's fully there. They have an idea, but like you said, it's not till they start cutting walls and things that they actually, and floors, that they actually see what's really going on.
Exactly. And, for our listeners, they might say, well, why is that? Well, once again, for what we're seeing on, let's just say it's a bathroom, what we're seeing on the wall on this side of the wall is only based on what's typically in that airspace. Once we cut that sheetrock out, the backside of the wall could have insulation, could have something else that would introduce a different mold type.
Absolutely. And so, once again, mold is the gift that keeps giving.
Exactly.
And sometimes I think people think that dealing with mold is a very straightforward cookie cutter process. Like you do the testing, then you get the results, then you remediate, and then it's good. And it never works that way.
No. And that's, it brings up another good point. Like, for our listeners, and they're saying, well, okay, Steve, what types of testing should we do? Once again, it all depends on their situation. If they've never dealt with mold before, for the most part, everyone in the home's healthy. We're not seeing any health concerns, no depression, chronic infections, things like that. That would change how I would, recommend to my clients or the listeners what types of testing should be done. Now, if they have a bunch of health issues, that's where I would say, hey, let's do maybe a medical test. Let's maybe do an EMA test. And I guess my whole point is for the listeners, every situation is different. So listening to this podcast episode is not going to answer all your questions.
I agree. And I think what I notice in the world of mold is that people tend to base what they believe is going on in their home or in their health with only having done one test or one type of test. We'd never go to a doctor and just look at one thing. We would do a bunch of panels.
Right.
And we would look at a variety of things because every system in the body interacts with every other system. What do you think of people who swear by one kind of mold assessment or mold testing and don't actually do a spectrum of things?
Well, the easy answer is there isn't a silver bullet test.
Correct.
That's going to answer all their questions. Now, if my wrist is hurting me, we go into the doctor and they x-ray it and it's broken, it would make sense to get a cast or have them do whatever they're going to do to fix that. But when you're talking about, like you said, like blood work, maybe they, take a urine sample and they're testing for whatever, you can't just base it off of one little thing. So to answer your question for our listeners, there's no definitive one size fits all, and there is no mold test out there that answers everything. Now, once again, it all depends on the situation. Let's say that you're trying to prove, and maybe you're a renter, maybe you're a homeowner, and the previous remediation company, totally botched the remediation. Maybe you're trying to prove something from a legal perspective that would determine what types of tests you should do. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
And a lot of times I see this all the time in the social media groups. What test holds up in court? Well, they all should. Mm-hmm. If the person doing the test and the lab and whoever else can justify and explain why they're doing it. So once again, it's not an easy answer. But on the other hand, here is what, in my opinion, so for our listeners, if you're doing remediation, one thing we always do with CNC Contractor Services, we always run a few air tests prior to remediation.
Correct. Got a baseline.
And that's all it is. And even, I already said this earlier, even that baseline might not be accurate. So for the listeners that are like, well, air testing, I've heard is not accurate. Well, it depends. But on the other hand, we have something to go off of.
But it's putting I guess the piece, like, is testing necessary if you see visible mold? I hear you saying yes. And a thorough investigation, including testing, but not just testing, is also required.
Exactly. For our listeners, don't just take one test. I don't care if it's an EMA, an ERMI. Do not take one test and make big decisions based on just one test.
Correct.
If you do an ERMI, which is the most common thing I see, and our listeners know this, I would prefer an EMA over an ERMI. But if you do an ERMI and you get a score of, 17 or 18, anything over 15's in the red, you shouldn't just immediately move out and think you have to abandon all your belongings.
Yeah. I mean, it's like somebody who finds that their one of their legs goes numb, jumping to, I must have MS. Well, there's a whole lot of reasons. You could have a
or
pinched
just
nerve,
amputation.
right? Like you could have a lot of things going on. It warrants time to investigate before you decide what you think it is.
Right. And it keeps, our listeners should probably understand it at this point. As you notice, I keep coming back to every situation is different. Does that make sense?
Yeah, every. And I guess the question is, you've said this, but what is the advantage of pre-remediation testing? And I think the bigger question for me is, how much should people spend? Because the amounts of money that some people spend on testing is a lot of money.
I've had clients that have spent in the over $10,000. To me, that's absurd. And any of our listeners that have dealt with me on a personal level and we've done remediation or testing or whatever, they know that I'm not a good salesman. I'm not into price gouging people. I am completely against spending that kind of money. Now, I have had clients that are like, hey, money's not really an issue up to a certain point. And I still tell them that. I just don't believe spending all of this money before remediation. Once again, this is the question you're asking is if we know we are doing remediation. If we know we're doing that, yeah, you should spend a little bit. But when I say a little bit, I wouldn't spend more than $1,000.
Yeah. And some people are spending 10, 15, 20, 30,000.
It's absurd.
Yeah.
And if you know you need remediation, my fellow professionals that are out there are going to hate me for saying this, but if you know you need remediation and your IEP is telling you, actually, before remediation, we have to do all these tests, it's not like they're making, if it's $10,000, it doesn't mean the IEP is making that money. A majority of that is lab fees. But I just don't think they're doing you a good service to tell you need all that.
No, I completely understand. And I mean, you want to capture what the full before picture is, and that's not just doing $10,000 worth of testing. That's also journaling and documenting.
Right.
What's going on, what you see, taking pictures, describing how you feel, so that after remediation and after that, you can go back to the before picture and say, is the after picture better?
Yeah. Well, and that's the interesting thing, because one of the questions I get all the time is, what if your PRV, which is post-remediation verification, what if those results are worse than the pre-remediation? People freak out and want to blame the remediator, and that's not always the case. So once again, for our listeners that let's say they did an ERMI test before remediation and they had a 17 for a score and then it jumped up to 20, does that mean your remediation company botched it? No.
No.
I mean,
but I guess this is the part that I haven't really heard talked about, and I'm curious your take on it. To me, when I think of mold, toxigenic mold specifically, I think of like lectins in nuts and lectins in plants. Like the lectin is the way the plant tries to ward off being eaten, so that even if you eat it, it hurts your digestive system because it spews the lectins. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I look at mold, toxigenic molds, as, first of all, they're mutants of what molds used to be a very long time ago. So they have survived a lot. They have mutated. They're worse than they were 100 or 200 years ago, which is why we have the problems we have. But in being like mutants, mold also is trying to survive. And so is it that when you do mold remediation, because it's the mold colonies are threatened, is it possible that the score gets worse? Not just, it could be because there's still mold at the house that wasn't part of the scope of work, but could it also be that the mold in being killed, I won't say killed off, but in being handled, fights to stay alive? Is that part of it or no?
Well, it can be. Once again, it depends on the containment and how it was removed.
Okay.
If you just go in there, and there are remediation companies that swear that you can fog and that takes care of everything. I proved that wrong this year. Yeah. I did my own case study. That is not true. But for what you're saying, it would be an EMA test, which is a mycotoxin test. Could you do the remediation and see the numbers went higher? If the testing was done in the same place with the same conditions, the same containment, it would be very difficult for that to happen, is my point. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, throughout the rest of the home, it's very common to have those issues because most people can't afford to do the small particle cleaning, which is the treatment of the rest of the home.
Okay.
Now, another scenario which we've ran into is, let's say it's just, so what you were saying, you would have had to have done mycotoxin testing.
Okay.
Which is the EMA test. And ERMI's not even going to do that.
Because the mycotoxins are the things the
Those are the
toxigenic
lectins.
molds spew out to defend themselves,
exactly.
Right? And that's why we created the mycotoxin prevention kit, because for those of you listening to this episode and you haven't listened to any of the episodes on mycotoxins, it's important to understand that toxic mold tries to survive by spewing out mycotoxins.
Exactly. And those are separate entities to the mold spores or the mold colony. So you have the mold infestation, behind the toilet on the bathroom wall. We go in, we set up a containment if it's only in the bathroom. So we isolate everything, do it under negative air. It releases those mycotoxins. Well, if we did the PRV testing outside of the containment after the containment is down, you would see some skewed numbers. But a scenario that I've ran into is, let's say we're in a containment and it's in a basement, it's one bedroom, the containment is part of the hallway, the secondary containment is at the base of the stairs. If you don't put supply air, meaning you would have to put an air filter in your containment, which you should. If you don't have an air supply, when we're running our air scrubbers inside that containment, the flood cuts, let's say, only go 4 feet up on the wall. You could actually be pulling air from inside that wall cavity or even outside the containment, and more or less, that's what's causing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't have fresh air supply, so the air scrubber's trying to find air, and so it's going to pull air from areas not where it's visible. Does that make sense?
Okay, that does make sense.
So it could pull the air from a crawl space, an attic. It could pull it from anywhere.
But let me ask you the question I think is on most people's minds when they deal with why are my numbers worse after remediation? If the numbers are worse, does that mean more remediation's needed?
Well, I would say so, yeah.
Oh, okay. I mean, I guess that's what people are afraid of. They're like, I paid this amount of money to have this remediated. I thought the numbers would get better, and in fact, they got worse.
Yeah, as a professional, I would have to ask, where was the mold infestation? Where were the containments? Did they provide supply air into the containments? Did you do a small particle cleaning after? There's just a lot of variables that you would have to bring into that equation.
And I think that's helpful for people to know, because I do think that a lot of people, especially if their mold issue is the first time they're having mold issues, they expect it to be fixed and done forever.
Yeah.
And mold is one of those things that unfortunately it can be, you could move from house to house, and every house you move into, it's just one of those things that it very rarely is one and done.
Yeah. And I get it. For our listeners, they're like, well, we don't have $60,000 to pay for remediation. Well, not that that's what remediation should cost. But my point is most people can't afford to pay the professionals to do the small particle cleaning. For our listeners, I always refer to it as the deep clean. But that kind of stuff needs to happen outside of the containment. And once again, a lot of these variables are dictated by who did the PRV testing, where was it done, were air scrubbers ran right up until an hour before, which is normie standards, whereas IICRC standards say you should shut off those machines 24 hours prior. There's just too many variables that I would have to literally dive deep into to get to why did the numbers get worse.
Absolutely. So at the end of the day, when people say, is testing necessary if you see visible mold, your take is?
You have to do some baseline testing.
Okay.
And for our listeners, I know it's easy to blame your remediation company if the air quality or PRV testing is worse. A lot of it's based on, and it could be your remediation company, but a lot of it's based on everything else in the home.
Absolutely. So what is your call to action for people?
Make sure you at least do before remediation. If our listeners are going to have remediation done, do at least air testing. Do a couple tests in the house, one where the containments are going to be, one outside of the containment, and then you have to have your baseline outside.
There we go.
And you talked about the mycotoxin digital package, but we have two packages.
We do. We've got the Mold 101 package, which if you are new to mold, I would highly recommend. You get Mold 101 so you have a firm understanding, but I'd also say get the mycotoxin prevention kit, because once you understand the basics of mold through Mold 101, now you're going to want to understand the ins and outs of mycotoxins.
Exactly. And I'll put the link in the description of the podcast, but if not, for our listeners, you can go to cnccontractorservices.com. I think there's a tab that says digital bundles.
And I think there's also a mycotoxin tab, I think.
Yeah. Either way, you can find it. So, all right. Well, we covered a lot. So I appreciate all of you for listening. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.